civil rights leaders. And these leaders are speaking differently than I've ever heard them speak before. They're talking about America as a white supremacist country. They're talking about pervasive systemic racism. They're giving a half glass empty understanding of America. And I think this is dangerous, and I think we should be careful about it. And, I don't keep a lot of things. I'm not a collector, but I kept that memo in a drawer for 20 some years, and I found it when I was writing the book because I remembered seeing this phenomena take shape. And when I was executive director of an organization called the David Project, which taught high school and college students how to advocate for Israel, mostly on college campuses, I remember in 2013 and 2014, there being a decided shift in attitude among college students that we had been working with. We had been taking leaders of various college groups to Israel, the head of the Black Student Union, the environmental groups, elites really, to Israel. And we felt we were making tremendous headway. And all of a sudden, some of the students, the non-Jewish students that we'd been working with, who were nowhere near the BDS camp, were starting to flirt with BDS because something in the environment had changed. That was the Ferguson riots in the United States. That was the onset of new social media like Tumblr. And others have written about this. Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff in their book, The Coddling of the American Mind, talk about that summer going into that school year, how something had changed in the environment on campus. It had been radicalized almost overnight. And so I had seen that and I had felt that as well. In 2016, I became the CEO of an umbrella organization in the US called the Jewish Council for Public Affairs. It's the umbrella of all the local Jewish community relations councils. And I had been seeing a phenomena of various causes connecting with each other, and a student used the term intersectionality. And so I wrote an opinion piece in 2016, my first day on the job, saying that this phenomena of intersectionality that no one had ever heard of in the mainstream Jewish community was being used to bring together groups like the Palestinian Solidarity Movement and the sex violence movement and Black Lives Matter and the like. And if this continues, we're in trouble. And it caused backlash that I had never experienced before. There were something like 8 op-eds written in reply to my op-ed. And so I realized by the time I got into that role, things were changing rapidly. And 2019, 2020, I could really feel the difference in my own ideological backyard. I was sort of on the center left. I was never an ideological progressive, but I was sort of a mainstream center left liberal with maybe a bit more of a neocon foreign policy streak. But by that time, I realized that the camp that I was operating with, I was profoundly disconnected. So when the George Floyd moment came, and there was this great so-called racial reckoning in the United States, and everybody was adopting anti-racism policies, and everybody was. I'm getting a little bit of back. Yeah, I'm starting to hear myself in the background. Okay, now it's better. All of a sudden, I realized that we were in trouble. So I left that post. I started a new organization, the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values, and I started warning the Jewish community with the letter that we launched, that I wrote with Brett Stevens and Barry Weiss and some other key people, Rabbi David Wolpe. There's a danger in the air now. This was in the spring of 2021. There's a danger. This ideology that divides up people neatly into oppressed and oppressors is spreading in our institutions, Jewish institutions even, and it's spreading in the larger society, and we are going to bear the brunt of that. That was what the letter said. I wrote my book shortly thereafter, warning further of this movement. Now, what you said, Casey, I think is absolutely key. This is not just the ideological movement on the left that's been afoot in our culture for quite a few decades, but it was also the convergence of that ideology and the activists behind it with the radical Muslim groups that were already operating on our shores, groups like the Council of American and Islamic Relations and the like, in that broader network of Islamist organizations. And so when you took those organizations were active on campus through groups like Students for Justice in Palestine, and you combine them with this sort of ideological conditioning of college students, it shouldn't have surprised us. And I like to think of where we are now as akin to where Israelis were after October 7th. We had our own conceptia, our own sense of what was going to happen. And we didn't understand, we didn't properly diagnose our own ideological environment. And just like I think Israel needs to have a reckoning, an internal reckoning about why it happened, I think American Jews and maybe Canadian Jews as well need to have a reckoning. Why weren't we aware of how bad things had gotten, and why were we so surprised when we saw 31 student groups at Harvard issue a statement on October 9th?
Yeah, absolutely. Well said. And part of this reckoning, David, and I've actually drawn on this article a bit for some of my own work and thinking. You have this article in Sapir called Jewish Community Relations and the October 8th Jew. I think that's a good, that article, and I would encourage everybody to go read it, is a good segue into, okay, so what have we been doing wrong? And what are the, whether they be communal or institutional or ideological, what are the, how did we not see this coming, or many people not see this coming, or recognize these issues sooner? What was the sort of architecture or the scaffolding that led to this?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And I'm going to answer it in a couple different ways.
Right.
I was very frustrated well before October 2023 that the Jewish community was not talking about this. I think some people were vaguely aware of this ideology working its way through our society, but they weren't dealing with it. It was fascinating because when we talked about anti-Semitism on the right, we didn't hesitate to talk about its ideological antecedents of the Great Replacement theory, for example. That we were freely willing to do. But for whatever reason, when we talked about anti-Semitism on the left, it was as if it came from nowhere, as if it would just magically appear somewhere. And we did not talk about the ideological well springs, because to do that put us fundamentally at odds with the kind of progressive allies that we had spent many years cultivating. Now I think this is probably the case in Canada as well, but I did some analysis and I looked at the 10 largest Jewish communities in the United States. And in every single Jewish community in the United States, they are in cities that overwhelmingly vote for Democrats, vote blue. Now, some of them are like Atlanta and the like are closer, but still, even in those places, even in these Jewish communities in red states and big cities, they still voted blue. So if you're a Jewish community, if you're living in a Jewish community in the United States or a place like Toronto, I imagine, or Montreal, whatever, you are in an overwhelmingly ideologically center left political environment. Um, I live in Montgomery County, Maryland. Montgomery County, Maryland is part of the larger DC community. There are 250,000 Jews in the larger DC community. There's over 100,000 Jews in Montgomery County alone. There has not been a Republican elected for local office in over 20 years in my area. So if you're the local Jewish Community Relations Council, if you're the Jewish Federation, and you're trying to raise money for necessary security precautions at synagogues and at JCCs and the like, if you're trying to continue the flow of money into Jewish institutions that provide social services, you are going to be very reluctant, and they are, to alienate people on the left. And what one thing that does that is to talk about the relationship between radical DEI and anti-Semitism. Because as soon as you do that, there are going to be people who are going to say that you're in with the Trump administration, that you're a far right-wing extremist, and you put your entire organization on the line. To me, that is the structural reason why many Jewish legacy organizations haven't fully pivoted in the wake of October 7th. There have been some signs that some people have. They've come out with more and stronger statements. They've built some new relationships, but not the kind of pivot that I would have hoped to see. And part of it is for those structural reasons I just stated.
Since October 7th, a lot has happened. And I don't know if I would say that everybody's woken up to these issues, but there have been some things, some of them I agree with, some of them I agree with, but don't agree with how they've been rolled out. For instance, some of what we're seeing the Trump administration do in the US at universities. Me personally, I like the idea of some of these things, but the way that it's happening, I find some of it I'm a little um, put off by. That said, those are there things that have been happening since October 7th that are changing the tide, turning the tide? Are things improving, or are they just worsening?
Yeah, I think that there are things that are improving. There's been a tremendous backlash um, against radical left-wing ideology in the country at large. And so people who could sort of, with impunity, attack somebody for saying the supposed wrong thing now find themselves being, attacked by the same kind of online mobs that people like me were once attacked. And
Right.
so I think that as they will say, like, we're past peak woke in the society at large. But what's happened is that in the institutions where this ideology reigns supreme, K through 12 education, higher education, certain nonprofit institutions, they're just doubling down on it. So while the tide has changed in the society at large, and there's a backlash, maybe less so in Canada than in the United States, by the way, because I think politics are different in the United States than they are in Canada. There's less of a backstop against this ideology in Canada than there is in the US. But I think that so we're no longer fighting against sort of a larger veil of silence as we did in the early days, like
Mm-hmm.
2021, 2022, 2023. The winds have changed direction. We have a new administration. That administration is taking seriously the issue of ideological anti-Semitism. But as you say, it can be a double-edged sword
Yeah.
because it also causes certain school systems to double down on what they're doing because now it's a resistance against the Trump administration. So they're not going to, open up discussions around the DEI program because they want to stand in solidarity with the resistance. That's how they're talking about it. In other places, by the way, it is causing them to open up and say, "Look, we don't need to go through this kind of scrutiny. This is not key to our educational mission. So let's put this on hold for now."
Yeah.
So it's a double-edged sword in that way. Universities obviously are complicated because I believe ultimately that we want our institutions to be what you might call liberal institutions. That
Yeah.
is to prize the free expression of ideas. I know some people are skeptical of that. And I will say this, that if you look at the rankings of universities in terms of free speech, which the organization FIRE does on an annual basis, the two worst universities or three worst universities in free speech, rock bottom out of 250 that they looked at, are Harvard,
Oh, wow.
Penn, and Columbia.
Wow.
So the very places where we're facing the biggest ideological headwinds are with the most extreme form of anti-Israel activity are places that also have very poor free speech cultures, where people are walking on eggshells, because what that tells you is that the ideological left is very dominant in those places. And where the ideological left is dominant, we're going to be weaker.
Mm.
So my sense is that the way to fight this is to get universities to dedicate themselves to institutional neutrality and to freedom of speech in a real way, not just say they are, because they say they're dedicated to free speech and then only apply that when it comes to Jews and not to anybody else. But ultimately, I think we have to be part of that larger movement of liberalization of these institutions, because we're not going to fare well as long as they're run by ideologues.
David, and I was speaking earlier today as part of this conference about, the evolution of anti-Zionism and the way that, you know, Soviet conceptions of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism have sort of permeated and lived on past the end of the USSR, and how they've sort of taken new shape through BDS and in activist circles and so on and so forth. Then after I was done speaking, I was just sort of thinking to myself about, the future of Canadian Jewry, the future of Jewish life in America. And I started thinking about this article. You may have come across it in March 2024 in the Atlantic, called "The Golden Age of American Jews is Ending."
I know it well. Yes.
Is that true? Like you're in the DC area. Uh, these two young Israeli diplomats were just gunned down. Um,
At an event that I started 20 years ago, by the way, when I was a
wow,
staffer at the American Jewish Committee.
didn't know that. Is there a part of you that's seeing this sort of stuff, seeing what happened in Boulder, with Governor Shapiro's house, where you're going, okay, like it's, where is this headed?
Yeah. Um, it's obviously it's hard to know, and there's a bit of conjecture here involved. I think we've lost power and don't realize it. In other words, and Dan Senor said this at his State of the Jewish Community. He said, American Jews enjoy prominence but are weak. And what he means by that is that we've gained a sort of incumbency status over many years. We have great connections. We get invited to the White House Hanukkah party. We know everybody, and and we give money to major institutions. And yet somehow in these very places where we've enjoyed this prominence, we've lost ground. We're less influential than we were. Yale's Jewish population went from something like 15% to 5% in just a few years. Um, and what it shows you is that these larger ideological forces have sort of overtaken us. Yet because we still enjoy this measure of prominence, we think we're stronger than we actually are. And I think that's a real danger. And it requires a paradigm shift in the thinking of the Jewish community. And it requires us to build a different set of alliances that are aligned with us on the kind of society that we all need to live in. In other words, they don't have to be with us foursquare on anti-Semitism every step of the way. But if an Asian American community or a Hindu community or an Asian Canadian community or a Hindu Canadian community understands that there's a radical takeover of your schools in Toronto or wherever else,
Yeah.
and knows that that's bad for them too, then you have allies. And you just have to cultivate those allies. Those aren't the people that we've been working with for many years because we still think we're in power and we want to be in relationship to the people that have stiffed us along the way
Mm,
because we think we're still holding on, we're still grasping, but we really have a much less influence than we used to in most realms. And I think that's the fundamental problem. And I think if we don't adapt to that, we don't start doing things differently, and it may not require, maybe this is where I'm starting to have some second thoughts about some of my advocacy around these issues. It may not require that the legacy organizations do exactly what I want them to do.
mhm.
Maybe they have to protect their own turf. Maybe they have to make sure that that security funding from the government comes in and not jeopardize it by doing what I want them to
Right.
do. But what that means is that there has to be a kind of strategic pluralism in the Jewish community
Mm,
that allows some of these younger, scrappier
yeah.
organizations that are not structurally bound to
Yeah.
go out and have more philanthropy and more room to operate than the legacy
Oh,
organizations have
wow.
traditionally allowed.
I'm thinking of the Chicago Jewish Alliance, for instance, with Josh. I mean, that's
Yes.
the sort of organization. These are, somebody like Josh and people that he's working with. These are, as you would say, like a new generation. I don't want to call anybody, on October 8th Jew, but definitely, uh, somebody like Josh is approaching these issues differently than my Zadie would, for instance. So
Yes.
um, there's something there. That's
Can I
very,
can I give you an example
yeah,
of
please.
a very, and it goes beyond the Chicago Jewish Alliance as well. Um, there was a mayor elected in Chicago named Brandon Johnson. He was
Okay.
elected by the Democratic Socialist wing of the teachers unions. And so what had happened basically in a place like Chicago, and you're seeing it elsewhere as well, is that the Democratic machinery, the Democratic Party machinery that has traditionally run these cities has lost its grip. And it's allowed for the more radical voices to win plurality votes. We're in danger of that in New York City right now as well. And so you had this very leftist mayor elected, and then when a ceasefire resolution came before the school board, he cast the tie-breaking vote, and the ceasefire resolution passed. And what the Chicago community had realized is that they were out of power. that the
Mm,
people who had traditionally extended them goodwill, that had helped them, that were there for the community, that
mm,
made sure that there was always a balanced discussion, those people were out of power themselves.
yeah.
And so the Jewish community, by extension, was one. So rather than do what they've always done, which is just curry favor to the people in power because they had a measure of it themselves, they now had to look at it and say, we've got to reclaim power. And a group of philanthropists started something called the Common Ground Collective there and raised significant funds so that in the next set of elections, they're going to be able to elect moderates to power there. That's their goal. And to
Mm,
neutralize the effect of some of the radical forces like the DSA and their role in teachers' unions. To me, that's the kind of shift in thinking that has to take
wow.
place if we're going to change the situation on the ground.
Absolutely. David, I could ask you questions all day, but I know there's other people in the room and I'm looking at the time. Matthew, do we want to maybe open it up and for questions? I know that there's probably a handful of folks that want to speak with David about whatever's on their mind.
Absolutely, yes.
Hi, David. Dasha. I have a question. You talk about working with allies and we don't have to agree on everything in order to work with them. And I mean, I'm part of Clarity Coalition and many of us do not agree 100%, but we agree on enough that we work together. I don't know if you know who Terracotta was.
I didn't hear the name clearly.
Tarek Fatah. He was a Canadian, brought a lot of attention to rising Islamist issues. He was a Muslim himself and raised a lot of questions to the Senate, even to the Senate of Canada, and was labeled Islamophobic doing it. He once told me that fundamental to any work with any ally is whether they accept the existence of the state of Israel. And if you sit down with someone who wants to be your ally and they say that fundamentally don't accept the existence of the state of Israel, is that someone that you can work with even if you agree on so much else, like issues in schools?
Yeah. Yeah, look, the problem is those are the very people who we don't agree on issues in schools.
Right.
In other words, like the people, I took my organization took a group of ethnic activists to Israel, in I think it was the spring of 2023. They were Black groups, they were Hindu American groups, they were Latino groups and the like. And these were groups that were all aligned with us against the radical ideology that we've been seeing in schools. And I have to tell you, it was the most seamless trip I've ever taken. There was like none of these sort of, I mean, people were wrestling with the complexity of the issues. And this was a time when judicial reform was major issue in Israeli society. But they weren't obsessed with what's going on with the Palestinians and the like, because most of them had understood that Israel's a Western style democracy and is morally superior in every way than its enemies are. So we didn't have that battle. Doesn't mean that they agree with us on everything all the time. It's just that they're aligned with us in that way, in a fundamental way. And so those to me are our potential partners. And if I find somebody who's extreme left, I mean, it doesn't mean that we can't work with them on anything ever. I'll leave it to others to do that. That's just not my cup of tea anymore. Maybe I've been there, done that. But I'm looking for allies now. I'm looking to refashion a new coalition, and I think it needs to be done in the U.S. and it needs to be done in Canada, and it's based on a set of values. That we renamed our organization the North American Values Institute because we want to include Canada, and because we understand that there are certain core values that bind our societies. The rule of law. These are what you would call classical liberal values. It is on that values, rule of law, freedom of expression, generally speaking, pluralism, e pluribus unum in the United States, out of many one. Those are core values. I want to work primarily with organizations and individuals who are aligned with us on those core values, because it's within that value system that we will find security and safety. And so I put aside any other issue that doesn't fit within that larger suite of issues or any other priority, because to me, that's the work that needs to be done right now.
Thank you. That's a great answer.
David, I think you were spot on. Probably more than you think about the way our what we call in Canada our big three organizations operate with regards to the education system. Earlier this year, the Vice President of Elementary Teachers of Toronto wrote to every trustee saying, "Let me remind you that CEJA, Friends of Simon Wiesel Fall Center, and Niagara spied on our children, misrepresented their comments, and spread lies about them, spied on our staff, and were probably to smear them, influence policy without accountability, etc." So the Toronto School Board in May decided to advance their anti-Palestinian racism resolution. And guess how the big three reacted? Oh, we'll talk to the trustees. We'll talk to the director of education. This will never hit the floor. Of course it hit the floor and passed by a vote of 10-5.
After the big three being
Niagara, CEJA,
yeah.
Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs, and Friends of Simon Wiesenthal.
There you go.
And the general of the reaction that came back from them was, "Oh, what hit us? We have no idea how this happened." Of course I know how it happened, because guess how many people were in the room, in the boardroom, when they passed that resolution representing the Jewish community? Zero.
Zero. Yeah, I was going to say zero.
I was the only one. Who was there from CEJA? Nobody, because they were taking the approach of saying, "Oh, we will represent the little villagers in the court to the Interior Minister of the Court of Tsar Alexander III. Don't you worry about a thing. We'll take care of you." Resounding success.
Right. Okay. So first of all, thank God I knew you all, and I knew Andrea Spindle going back a couple years, and when the issue of anti-Palestinian racism first emerged in Toronto, I knew about it because I had already had relationships with you all, and I'd been following and I started reading about it, and I knew immediately that it was coming to the United States. I didn't know how, but I knew immediately. We did a background report of it right away. We wrote op-eds about it, warning there's a radical ideology coming to a school district near you because of what happened to you all. I hate to say it, but it used to be that what starts in California never ends in California. Now I say what starts in Toronto or Canada never stays in Toronto or Canada. I didn't hear that last comment.
It starts in Toronto. That's exactly right.
Yeah, it starts in Toronto. I could see it in the early days after October 7th, when the tone and tenor of the radical Muslim groups who were protesting on the streets was more extreme than what I was hearing in the United States. And so I thought, okay, that could easily happen here too, and it did. Look, I don't want to, I'm not going to cite any specific groups. You can do that. But I do think that Canadian Jewish legacy organizations, American Jewish organizations have to ask themselves why they were caught so flat-footed and why they weren't in that room with you at that time. They have to reflect on that. I know many of them understand the threat of it now, but they missed an opportunity to perhaps inject themselves into a discussion. And as a result, we're now dealing with this on in multi-fronts. And by the way, it's actually made it even harder to advocate for the IRA definition of anti-Semitism, because as soon as you advocate for IRA, it opens up the possibility that these groups will then use that to get the APR into school systems. So it becomes actually even more dangerous for us to push IRA, because we may end up empowering APR. So, that's just the reality that we're living in right now in these areas. And I think it requires a shift in thinking from incumbency mentality to insurgency mentality. That doesn't mean we have to become jerks. It doesn't mean we have to act in an uncivil manner, but it does mean that we have to understand that we've lost power and that we have to behave in a way that's designed to regain power and not to pretend that we're defending what we already have, because we've lost a lot of grip in key institutions around North America.
Thank you.
Matthew, do we have a couple more questions for David?
Yes, we do.
Yeah, hi, David, Casey, it's Andrea.
Oh, hey, Andrea.
Hi,
Hi.
Andrew.
So, maybe two things. I understand the idea that we've lost power, we should regain it, but I'd like you to explore that, maybe both of you, a little bit more. I heard Jeffrey Lax speak about the fact that New York is 20% Jewish, and at one time the professors across all of their campuses were probably 20% Jewish. Now they're less than 1%, and he's the only one left in his university. So if the universities have been taken over and the student populations are intimidated or even dropping out or not applying or whatever, and the kids are being educated by this DEI garbage, where do you see the power shift coming? We're in Canada, in particular, a very tiny population. I've heard people say, well, we should all, get more Jews running for school board, get Jews on city council, whatever. But we're not going to ever have the numbers to be a majority. I know that the biggest major theme today and elsewhere is about building allyship, but not everybody wants to serve in a leadership role. So talk a little bit more about what you mean when you say regain power. That would be my first question. And the second is about APR, which has now been adopted by not just the schools, but the governments. And again, if we don't have leadership at the top, whether it's conservative, provincial, or federal liberal, if they're reinforcing the worst, how is it that we're ever going to turn this around?
Yeah, okay. So let me start with the first question, and they're very related, obviously. How are we going to regain power? Look, when I say we've lost power, it doesn't mean we've lost it everywhere equally, right? There are still places where we have some leverage, and I think the meta strategy is to use the power where we're strong to try to address where we're weak. Okay, so if we have strong ties with certain elected officials, use them the best we can, fully leverage them to try to neutralize some of the ideological forces. This sometimes works. We sometimes are able to elect school board members. We just hired an amazing woman named Sharon Sorkin in Ann Arbor, Michigan, whose school board was as hostile as any you'll see in the country. And she took it upon herself to change those dynamics. She started what we call a 501c4 organization that allows you to raise money for elected officials and campaigns. And they were able to turn the tide in Ann Arbor by electing new school board members that were more moderate in nature. The other principle of this is that we can also use their extremism against them. The good news about our enemies, is that they can't help themselves and they're driven to extremes. So in Pareto Valley, California, which is a hotbed of anti-Zionism and a hotbed of radical ideology in the schools, you had two school board members, and my colleague Mika Hackner, who I see on this and listening in, found the agendas in the school board in which and was able to watch the footage of the school board in which Jewish community members were basically told that they're acting out of white Jewish privilege for opposing radical ethnic studies. Now, we publicized that, and we were able to use that to raise awareness of the dangers of this ideology elsewhere, and we achieved some victories that I'm not going to go into as a result of being able to expose the radicals in those places. So that's another core strategy, is that we have to use it. Now, I don't want to overstate this. There's reason for pessimism. There's some reason for optimism. I think you have a harder uphill battle in Canada than we do, because the demographics are different in Canada than they are in the United States. The Jewish community still enjoys superior numbers, superior philanthropy. Yes, true, Qatar is a major force here and makes things a lot harder than they would be otherwise. But we still have sources of leverage and power that I think we can reclaim. I think it's harder for you all. Again, I don't want to say that you can't win anywhere, because I think you probably can. And I've seen examples, and I've been told of examples of where you have won and where you've still been able to use whatever leverage you have to neutralize some of the worst forces in society. But I think it's because the demographics are here and because the politics in the United States, Americans generally do not like radical ideologues that are forcing them to walk on eggshells, that are teaching their kids crazy stuff. And there's a natural backlash in American society that we're seeing underway. I'm not sure I've seen the same thing in Canada yet, because of the political and social dynamics are different. So I can't say that I can project forward from what the United States has faced to what's going to happen in Canada. I'm sorry if that feels a little pessimistic, but that's sort of my current thinking. Yeah, remind me about APR, Andrea.
Oh,
The
APR,
question on
yeah,
APR.
it's been adopted as a policy or a position
Yeah.
at several levels of government. It's being
Yeah, I
pushed
know. I've been.
into the schools, right? I think our
It
federal
has
government
been.
has now accepted it and added it to its anti-racist strategy.
Yeah, we
Oh,
have
not
not
yet.
seen Mika.
Not
Mika,
yet,
Mika
Andrea.
Hackner. Mika Hackner, who's on. I don't know if Mika can unmute herself. If she's literally the U.S. expert on APR. I don't think we've seen a lot of examples of APR being officially adopted yet. I think they would, I can imagine in a couple of school districts where they will officially adopt it. But like where I live, Montgomery County, which is overwhelmingly Democratic, there's no way they would get through APR through my school board at this point. Maybe I can't tell you what will happen in 10 or 20 years. That's not where we are now. So there's still a wellspring of Jewish leverage that can be brought to bear more forcefully in the U.S. front to stop APR from going as deeply as it has in Canada.
Thank you. Anybody else?
Gonna answer that's my question. There was
Well, actually, I'm going to say another thing, which is, it's not just our school boards; it's also the regulatory bodies of our professions. I'm not sure how teachers are regulated in the United States, but in Canada we have provincial colleges of teachers, and I've been filing complaints against various teachers for about 4 years now. I think I've done about 3 dozen of them. But 2 weeks ago, a teacher in Ottawa who won the Prime Minister's Award and the Elementary Teachers Award for anti-racism is up on charges before the disciplinary tribunal, because she said that people who support Hamas or sympathize with them should be deported. That is, at least from my observation, normal political discourse in your country as it is in ours. The Prime Minister of Canada said the same thing right after October 7th. Yet here she is facing discipline tribunal charges. So it seems, in my observation, that the College of Teachers is engaging in not only a double standard, but essentially viewpoint discrimination in how it applies its regulatory principles. And again, I find that the major organizations are stunningly silent about it. And this creates a dangerous precedent, because it's going to be almost illegal to be actively Zionist while holding a teacher's license.
Yeah, that's very concerning. And I think that your laws are such that and the regulatory structures that you speak of make it easier for them and harder for us. Look, our teachers' unions are probably as captured as your teachers' unions are, but they run up against some natural roadblocks in parent activism and governors, city council members and others. Like, they don't have a free reign of it. Our teachers' colleges are probably as far gone as yours. But again, we're in a political environment in which their ideas taught in isolation come up against the bedrock of American politics. And so our job is to mobilize those forces in American politics, that those antibodies in our system, to make it harder for them to get their way. And I do think it's doable. It's going to take a long time. It's going to take a few years, maybe a decade or more, in order fully neutralize them, and we're going to have to hope that the political environment continues to blow in our direction. But yes, it is very concerning when you see when you see APR and how it's affecting the Canadian discourse. And I think that it's got to be all hands on deck against that. And if I would almost be single issue in that way, like if I'm meeting with elected officials, if I'm meeting with allies, philanthropists, and others, I would constantly talk about APR. And you'll be talking about a much larger set of issues when you do so, because I think that the institutionalization of that is going to cause problems for decades to come.
David, and maybe Casey too, if we haven't, he's about to leave us, I know, but when we were worried about right-wing anti-Semitism, we saw Jews being excluded from profession after profession. Now that leftist anti-Semitism, as we tend to talk about it history is repeating if you think about it. As I'm listening to your remarks, that's what occurred to me. So, and we see working at CAF and with the other organizations that I'm involved with, we see, right? Jews are being pushed out of professions. Jewish kids are not going into medicine. The Jews that are in medicine can barely stand it. We've heard story after story, and the Canadian Jewish News actually just did a piece interviewing teachers in public schools about how they're being pushed out and taking early retirement, scared to say anything in the classroom for fear. Not that it's completely new, but it's the level, I suppose. I mean, you could think of profession after profession that the Jewish kids are not going into out of fear, or maybe they're not even getting in. We don't even know the metrics on that. What do we do, right? We make the distinction between left and right, but in some ways, we're back where we started 50, 100 years ago.
Yeah.
So what do we do?
You want to start on that?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just jump in here. I see Mark Sandler also has a hand up. Mark, I didn't know if you wanted to jump in on answering this question. I mean, the first thing that comes to mind for me, and maybe this is that sort of scrappy attitude that we were talking about earlier, David, but is to not give in to any of that, and to not be silenced, to not be pushed out. If you're a physician, please don't leave and go to the US or Israel. If you're a teacher, please don't stop being a teacher. Hunker down and do whatever you need to do to resist that bullshit and be completely and unapologetically Jewish and Zionist if that's who you want to be. Our adversaries, our enemies, whether those are state, non-state, whether they're far right, far left, anti-Zionist, anti-this, they want to suppress Jewish life. They want to push people out of these organizations and these circles. And we can't let them. David, Mark, I don't know if you have any other thoughts on this.
Well, I do. Very nice to meet you, David. And you can take 5 minutes off my 3:30 presentation, but I do think this is an opportune time to say this, that we identified in our organization, and David, we're a coalition of 60 community organizations, including some of them who you're hearing from, including CAEF and Allied Voices for Israel and the like. And at our last meeting, we identified APR as right at the top of the list of issues that we're going to mobilize on. So we created a small task force. We're working towards how we're going to operationalize this. We've created all the materials that are necessary on fighting APR, including a combination of scholarly articles, briefing notes, social media items, and so on and so forth, to make the case in a clear, straightforward, and scholarly way. But what I wanted to say here, and it foreshadows what I'll be saying at 3:30, is I actually think the APR fight is going to end up in our courts of law, because in my view, you cannot sustain a definition of APR that effectively discriminates against the Jewish community, and it cannot survive charter scrutiny. It cannot survive an analysis by the Ontario Human Rights Commission, which already gave kind of a B- quality response to the desire that APR be incorporated into the Ontario Human Rights Commission policies, and that was rejected. And we are still at the stage now where government has done this kind of soft entry into the field where they referred to anti-Palestinian racism, but they haven't wrestled with the definitional issues around it. And our adversaries are doing that deliberately. They incorporate the term, and then they seek to have adoption of the Canadian Arab Lawyers Association definition that in effect creates, demonizes anybody who's a Zionist or anybody who disagrees with the Palestinian narrative. That cannot survive constitutional scrutiny. It just absolutely cannot. So I do think that in addition to
Very good to hear, by the way.
Pardon
That's
me?
very good to hear. That's very
Yeah.
good to hear.
Yeah. So it just can't, because you can't include as an anti-racism strategy that you will characterize another protected group under our human rights code as racist by definition. So it's deeply problematic on that score, and I feel pretty confident about that. You know, time will tell whether I'm right or wrong, but I do think we have a more difficult task than you do for all the reasons that have been indicated. But I also do think that we're at a stage now where we first have to educate our own community, because I have to tell you, David, our own community doesn't understand APR. Our own community doesn't even understand the IRA definition and why it's fundamentally different than the APR definition. And so we're going to embark upon some educational sessions to make sure, first of all, that our community understands these issues, that our allies understand these issues, because one of our talking points with our allies is, you know, the Asian community is asking itself, why aren't we talking about anti-Asian racism? Why aren't we talking about anti-Ukrainian racism? What's so special that we are just carving out this category that not only demonizes the Jewish community, which is our ally, but why are we creating this category? And that's one of the talking points that I think is important as well. We need our allies to see that this affects them. So we are developing a strategy around it. You're absolutely right. It's like Israel apartheid. Everything bad on these issues starts in Toronto, starts in Canada. I spoke to people in England about this. They'd never heard of APR until I introduced it to them. Now everybody's heard about it. And it wasn't in the US when I was first dealing with it as well. So we're the authors of it, so we're going to have to work hard to clean it up. But one of the ways we're going to have to clean it up, I think, is through legal action.
If you win, we'll probably win too. So please continue fighting. We need you to win, because it will also deter it from spreading in the United States. But
you know, David, I can tell you as a lawyer that if we do succeed in Canada on it, American lawyers will have to get over American exceptionalism. Like, they'll have to take the victories where we're getting them internationally, which they don't always do, I can tell you. You know what I mean? Like, they tend to think everything is an American solution to an American problem. And so if we have some success, great. We also build on successes in the US. So we have to be collaborative that way.
Okay. Exactly. So let's compare notes. I know the legal structures are different, the regulatory structures are different, the politics are a bit different, but there's also a lot in common. We're fighting against the same bad people trying to do the same bad things, and we need to be comparing notes, because more of our strategies are likely the same than they are different, and even if the environments are slightly different.
Exactly. Thank you. Sorry to interrupt the dialogue.
Okay. Well, I think is Casey still there? Or did he already leave? Casey already
We have to
left.
leave.
David, I'd like to thank you immensely from all of us
Thank you
for
all.
being here today, for presenting on a very important, critically important topic right now. And Mark, as well, I'd like to thank you for your input there. You actually had my juices flowing from a Canadian perspective on a question is, does it even matter if it's adopted as an actual legal adoption? If enough people actually believe it, even if it's not used, even if the actual lingo isn't words, if the actions are implemented, how do we maneuver that from a legal standpoint?
Yeah, yeah. You were breaking up a little bit, so I couldn't make out everything that you said. I'm
Sorry, I
sorry.
would just ask a really brief question was, I completely agree with you that it's going to be in the courts, and especially what David was saying, and through the discussion with Casey, is even if it never is adopted in a legal, actually adopted in the legislation, does it even really matter if enough people in positions of authority are utilizing it and not even necessarily utilizing it, utilizing the name, but utilizing the implementations of it in schools, in politics, and discriminatory measures? How does anyone fight against that when it's being implemented but not actually officially?
See, the challenge that we talked about just yesterday when we were creating this subgroup working on it is that people have to understand not just that we're opposed to it, but why we're opposed to it, why it has implications for them, why it doesn't work for the community at large. And so part of this is that educational piece. And if we can't sell the educational piece, because they're very clever, the argument that's made in Canada, and I'm sure the argument that's made in the US is, who could be against incorporating into anti-racism policy something that prevents racism against Palestinians? And so one of the talking points has to be, this has nothing to do with discrimination against Palestinians. We're all against discrimination, whether it's directed against Palestinians, Arabs, Muslims, Jews, Israelis, and the like. But this has nothing to do with it. This has to do with promoting a political, ideological agenda that brands all Jews who support the existence of the state of Israel as racist. That's what this is about. It has nothing to do with anti-racism strategy. It has nothing to do with racism. And so that's the educational piece that we have to communicate, because if we don't, you're right. If people are incorporating it, even if it doesn't have legal impact, then our position's being undermined anyway. So they have to understand what this is really about and what it's not about. And that's why we're speaking to our allies, because they have to understand the implications of it for them as well, right?
Exactly. Well, I'd like to thank you, David, once again. We're just going to move on to the next panel, and I'm introducing them now. I have to welcome Dr.
Thanks,
Mike.
everybody.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.